I've got a lot of information to share, so I might go a bit quickly, but you're going to be recording it, so you can always go back and check up on anything if you want to get a bit more information. So let's let's go. And what I did last time, which seemed to work, was to use I've got 3 books that are currently out, which people seem to like. But the left-hand one there, the RSPB Handbook of British Birds, is very up to date, and the new edition has a sort of fact file in it, and I've cribbed that for each of the species. So, and we'll look at just 1 or 2 of the interesting facts and share those with you. So I'm glad you chose Great Crested Grebe. I put it first because it is. I usually count this as my favourite bird. I mean, on different days I have different favourite birds, but I think traditionally it was one of the first birds I really got to know really well. I grew up in West London, around Heathrow. We had gravel pits there, and on those I found Great Crested Grebes. And nobody told me they were there. And so it was a really exciting discovery. Of course, it was well known they were there, but I found them, and therefore I had a sort of personal relationship with this bird. So let's have a quick look at Great Crested Grebes and what we know about them. And this is from the book. We can see they're green, which means they're a stable species. Not a huge, vast number, but nevertheless, there's no ups and downs. And a few other things to notice. Many more in winter than summer. Probably because obviously we've got young from the year, which swell the population, but we must get some continental immigrants as well. So we do get birds coming across from Northern Europe to join our birds. Not huge numbers, but at least some. And the other thing to notice is that they can live up to 19 years. And I'll highlight the age each. I'm always fascinated by longevity of species, so I'll be looking at some of the species. So here is our typical Great Crested Grebe. I think these are very London photographs. I think I photographed all these I'm using my photographs as far as possible tonight. I think I much prefer to use my own. And I think I photographed this in Regent's Park. So it really is a London bird in London and a London venue. That summer plumage, very familiar. This is winter plumage, non-breeding plumage. Perhaps it's a better way of putting breeding and non-breeding, better way of talking about it. I think actually this is a first-year bird, which probably has never had its full breeding plumage. It's got those little marks on its head. But anyway, that's what they look like in winter. And I like this picture because the bird was about to scratch, and you can see this amazing foot that you don't usually see, which is sort of not quite webbed. It's called lobed. It's got sort of paddles on each toe, and it can go completely flat or push itself very rapidly through the water. And it's used, of course, for swimming and catching fish underwater. And in fact, I found this old illustration of Great Crested Grebe. It is quite impossible that they ever did this. This is what scientists thought they used to be able to do, was stand up on their back legs and use these amazing feet for standing up. Well, in fact, they're situated too far back on the bird's body, and it would fall flat on its breast or crush those eggs in front of it. So that is a totally fictitious picture. But this is early. This is a 19th century illustration. A little bit on history. They were once very rare. We can claim the RSPB had a lot to do to help Great Crested Grebes. They were reduced to 32 to 72. Nobody knows quite how many pairs in 1860, 2 different figures around. Really quite a tiny number. Thought they were going to go extinct. It recovered. There's less persecution. They were being persecuted for their feathers. It was exactly what the RSPB was formed to do, to stop the feather trade and to stop persecution of birds for exotic feathers. It wasn't so much the crests and the bits around the head as you might think. I think those probably were taken, but it was the breast fur, breast feathers, which look so dense they feel like fur. And grebe fur was highly, highly sought after to make Victorian ladies muffs to keep them warm when they went to church, that sort of thing. So there was less persecution when the new acts came in. Legal protection helped the Great Crested Grebe, and I think probably even more than that, new habitats were formed. The Great London reservoirs started to be built, and then the gravel pits came in afterwards, and so they had new places to live. And now there are 4,300-ish. No, that's not an accurate figure, but that's what the latest figures we have for breeding birds. But you see 1,600 in winter. So winter immigration is obviously going on. Their habitats, this is typical habitat. I used to watch mine on the Penn Ponds in Richmond Park quite a lot, and this was the sort of habitat they had, this sort of open water with emergent vegetation around the edge. And this is where they breed, and of course their breeding has been much studied. There's a pair in breeding plumage. I've never managed to, oh, this is where I have had to cheat and borrow somebody else's photograph, because I've never photographed them in doing their various dances. Oh, this is my picture though. This is how they often start. A pair of great crested grebes doing what this preening, and this is preening that grebe fur underbelly. Often they do this slightly agitated before they start their display. Often they get quite aggressive. They're not quite sure if the approaching bird is a male or a female, and they growl and go along the water like this, and then they come together and they do their head shaking. So that's as good as I've managed to get. I've got another couple of library pictures to show you in close up, something you're much more familiar with, I guess, a proper grebe display and the weed dance. And this was all studied by Julian Huxley back in the middle of the 20th century, and was one of the first birds to be properly studied, its courtship displays properly studied and written. And it's a lovely little monograph that still stands up to critical appraisal even today. This is a typical nest site, not a great picture, but typical place. You just see the grebe going in, emergent vegetation again, taking waterweed. They only use waterweed. They don't come on land to get any nest material, and it's taking new nest material. But this photograph is actually somebody else's, and I do like it though, because the nest is not attached to emergent vegetation. It's attached to floating vegetation, bits of reed stems. And in doing this, and indeed the other nests as well, the great crested grebe achieves something quite remarkable. What it does, it achieves a floating nest. And not only floating, it means that it can change with the levels of the water. So sudden rains and the water levels rise, the nest is less likely to get flooded. So a floating nest that can change with water level change, quite remarkable. And the other thing they do, not remarkable, other birds do it, but not too many. Very bad picture, but you can just see what's going on there. When they have small young, they carry them on their back, and they really look rather cute. And they can get one or two on the back of each parent, and this protects them from big predatory fish like pike. There's a juvenile great crested grebe looking very stripy in autumn. And one problem they have are gulls, which come and molest them when they're fishing. And you'll see this on lakes very commonly. Gulls seem to, especially black-headed gulls, seem to spot fishing great crested grebes and come down and dive bomb them. There's the population graph. It's bouncing along, never stable, but it's not doing anything over dramatic. And finish these little flurry of great crested grebes with one of my favorite pictures of one in autumn when it's just losing its breeding plumage and going into winter. So a quick look at great crested grebes. We'll have a quick now look at sparrowhawks and kestrels, try and fitting two species into the same spot. Let's see how this comes out. Sparrowhawk, I'm sure you're familiar with. We'll talk about how to recognize them in a minute. And kestrel. I thought it was worth pairing these two off rather than doing one and then another one perhaps at another time, because there are some similarities and some differences. So let's have a look at what those similarities and differences are. Looking at the table from the books, we just look at the top to see, well, no, a few things actually. We can see that Sparrowhawk is green and it's stable currently, and they take a long time to breed. So it's over a month with eggs in the nest and up to a month with young in the nest. So it's very slow breeding, 2 months. They can only fit in one brood a year. And we've got again, drawing your attention to the longevity. At least one has managed to reach the age of 20. Of course, we never know if that was a fluke or whether that's normal. But I still think it's interesting information to collect. If we compare that to kestrel, we've now got an amber species. And it's a species that's showing what's termed a moderate decline currently. I'll show you some charts in a minute. we can see once again it's a long term. It's not, the young aren't in the nest quite, sorry, the eggs aren't in the nest quite as long as for the sparrowhawk, but they still take, the young take 37 days before they fledge. So again, takes a long time to breed. And we again, surprisingly, pure coincidence, I think, the oldest known bird at the present time is 20 years. Identification, things to remember. Sparrowhawks are brown and sometimes bluish. The males are certainly bluish. They have barring on the underparts, that's important, and rounded wings. And they have short wing beats followed by a rapid glide. And they hunt with speed and take their prey by surprise. So Kestrel, just compare that. It's brown and sometimes sort of reddish brown, quite russet. There's some bluey colours on the head, so it's a bit confusing, but never as bluey as the back of a male sparrowhawk. It's got streaks, so the underparts are streaky and not barred. So one, they go across the breast of the sparrowhawk and down the breast for Kestrel. And it generally has pointed wings, although all these birds can change the angle of their wings and really confuse you, but nevertheless, generally their wings are pointed, and I'll show you some pictures in a minute. And they have a series of fast, rapid wing beats. They don't have the long glides that's typical of the sparrowhawk. But of course, the one thing with Kestrel is its ability to hover. It's an absolute master of stationary flight. They almost fly head into the wind at a speed which means that they're stationary. And the head is perfectly still, and they're using that to scan the ground below. And the male and female are similar, whereas I didn't say it before, but the female sparrowhawk is larger than the male. There's quite a big size difference, and they hunt very often different size prey, which means the young get smaller prey from the males and larger prey when they're a bit older from the females. So that's beneficial. But anyway, but male and female kestrel are the same size. And here is a photograph of photographs. It's Dungeness. I remember this bird. A female kestrel, a female sparrowhawk hunting on the hunt. It came very close to me. It totally ignored me. It got its eye on a flock of starlings, I think. And you can see the wings are very rounded there. There's a hunting sparrowhawk. And I know you can't see it very well, and you're not meant to see it very well because this is where they loiter before they fly out speed to snatch prey. They don't fly fast for long distances. They tend to loiter somewhere where they're under cover and then shoot out. And here's a kestrel just leaving its perch, and it would have been perching, and you'll see some pictures in a minute, at the top of a tree or a post. This looks like a tree, and is shooting off, and you see how its wings here are very, very pointed indeed. This is a male kestrel, got bluey on the head, lovely tail band showing those black end, the terminal band of the tail, jet black. Now, this is how they often hunt, is perched. You know about them hovering. I've not got many photographs of them hovering, so I'm showing you perched ones. But you've seen them probably more often perched, often on telegraph poles, sometimes on buildings, sometimes on wires, and they're scanning in the ground for prey. And this is quite typical. They'll even be in those sort of places right into dusk, not quite total darkness, but well into the early evening, and you just get this silhouette, but typical silhouette of a kestrel. There is migration, and I looked at PTO records, and they've got a map, and it shows, don't worry about the coloured dots, but it shows the parts of Europe where we get kestrels from, or sometimes some of our kestrels get too, but I think it's mostly kestrels coming from these places, arriving in the British Isles, or in some cases coming in the British Isles and then going on further south. And you'll see there's quite a lot of movement between southern Scandinavia, the Baltic countries, and perhaps, as you'd expect, more likely around the Low Countries, northern France, but even down into some birds getting down into Spain and the odd one in North Africa. So some birds are moving quite a long way. Sparrowhawk migration, similar sort of pattern, but not nearly so many records. So I think we can assume that that's much less likely, much I could say rarer, perhaps not rarer, but less habitual than kestrel. Diet, well known, of course. I'm sure you know a lot of this stuff. Sparrowhawks, of course, feed on birds, up to the size of thrushes and even collared doves. And I've seen a female, because they're bigger, a female sparrowhawk take a wood pigeon. So they can take a lot of birds. Thrushes are perhaps in more normal size, but certainly small birds in gardens, I'm afraid, down to blue tits and robins. They all feature in the diet. They're not selective. They use stealth and surprise. I sort of indicated that just now, to chase down their prey. And the female is more likely to hunt in open country because she's a bigger bird and take bigger prey. And that's where the bigger birds tend to be. Kestrel, mainly small mammals, not exclusively, because they do take some birds, but they don't have that way of chasing them in the same way a sparrowhawk does. They also take quite a few invertebrates, even down to earthworms, but they eat quite a lot of beetles as well. If you look at a kestrel pellet, you sometimes find beetle remains in it. And something remarkable is that they can see ultraviolet, and this allows them to see the urine trails of voles, small mammals. Sorry, it's a bit hidden that, but it's small mammals of voles, particularly in the countryside, have tracks running through the long grass, and a hovering kestrel can see the tracks, but they can see them more clearly because they're seeing through ultraviolet, and which allows the urine to be visible. And so I sort of visualize it, and of course we've never seen this to really know, but I sort of visualize it like they've got a little road map down below them, of little traces of where the voles, not where they are at that moment, but where the runs that they're using frequently, and therefore that gives them a good clue as to where they can do their hovering. And here's one back on a post, and not hovering. I think I'll get you one hovering one in a minute, but I've only really got one picture I'm happy with. Breeding, sparrowhawk nest in a fork of a tree, builds it with sticks, or take over a nest of another species like a missel thrush or a jay, and builds a new nest each year. And the male provisions the nest. So the female is looking after the young. He is provisioning her. On the kestrel side, the nest site is more likely to be, it could be in a fork of a tree, but it's more likely to be in a hole, a ledge, on a building, or even in a building. Even a hole in a hollow tree is quite likely for kestrel. And they like using nest boxes. And in some parts of the world, certainly in Holland, where they wanted to encourage kestrels to nest on the flat countryside of the polders of Holland, they put up lots of nest boxes. I think it was in the 60s and 70s, and they were taken. I think they did a lot to increase the kestrel population. And it's the female that does most of the incubation. So again, it's the male that's doing the provisioning, and bringing in most of the prey, at least when the young are small. When they get bigger, they probably need two parents. Same for sparrowhawk, they need two of them doing the hunting. But when they're smaller, the male is quite attentive. Here's a sparrowhawk in my garden, after the birds on my bird table. Haven't seen it this winter, but I think it's still around, or a bird is still around. Conservation, just a thought. Birds of prey have always been controversial, and they still are. You only have to think of the controversy around hen harriers at the moment to know that not everybody likes birds of prey. They get taken and trained for falconry from earlier times. I mean, that goes way back into Roman times and even earlier, that the art of falconry, and it goes on, and it still goes on today. But most birds today are taken legally, or more likely to be bred in captivity. But it's been a problem in the past for many birds of prey, particularly peregrines, actually. But sparrowhawks were always a popular bird for falconry, used perhaps a lady's hawk, perhaps. I think it was kestrel for a knave, wasn't it? And sparrowhawk perhaps more likely to be for a priest. But persecuted by people on field sports. I mean, they would take pheasant chicks or sporting game, feather partridge particularly. So they're not liked and haven't been liked by gamekeepers. They're now protected by legislation, which we hope works, but not always. But like most of the birds of prey, severely damaged by the persistent pesticides back in the 50s and 60s and early 70s. Huge population slump at that time. Um, but they have adapted more recently, much more recently, to live in suburban and urban and even city areas. So they have actually changed their locations. Here's a population of sparrowhawk, and you can see these aren't completely up to date. They're online on the BTO website, but they haven't brought them any more up to date than this. But it still shows the trend, which is really what you want to look at without bothering too much about the actual the figures. But you can see how they were growing back from the 1960s, coming up, and then leveling off in the 1990s to 2005, 2010, and then suddenly since then dropping away a bit. Not perhaps to where they were, but a worry there with Sparrowhawk, although it's still regarded as stable species. Kestrel, you can see that there wasn't so much of a decline, and there was a big surge in the 70s and 80s. And since then, that hasn't been replicated, and it's been bouncing along at a much lower figure, and it's starting to drop off further. And that's judged to be more worrying, moderate decline, and therefore given an amber status. I'll just show them. This is terribly technical, but just an interesting picture. This is the dates on which sparrowhawks lay their eggs. It's a straight line. Okay, nothing much to see there, but compare it to Kestrel. Right, now you can see the difference. That's not a straight line, and that is showing that kestrels are actually laying their eggs earlier than they have back in the 1960s and 70s. Not by a massive number of days, but perhaps by a week or so, and that we can assume is linked to climate change or perhaps food availability. But then food availability is probably linked to climate change. So that's there. Picture of Sparrowhawk, really showing those rounded wings as I was trying to describe before, and picture of Kestrel showing the pointed wings. And this bird actually is hovering. That's why I was managed to get not even a decent picture, but at least you can see what it's doing. I'll get a good Kestrel hovering one day, but probably too late for this series of talks. But this is much more common. Kestrel on top of a tree, even quite a flimsy branch, looking for prey below it. And here's a sparrowhawk in vegetation, waiting for more small birds or something. And they're not actually camouflaged, but they don't stand out in the countryside. So we'll look at house sparrow. There's probably a bit more to house sparrows. There's quite a lot here. Lots of pictures to share with you. I do like taking photographs of house sparrows. We can look first of all at the chart from the book, and we can see that we've got a red data species here, and it's now labeled as this is moderate decline. Which on the face of it is strange, because you can see here that they're capable of producing between 2 and 4 broods a year. So that's potentially can produce quite a lot of youngsters. The other thing is that, again, their longevity is surprisingly long, and there's a record of at least one that reached 19 years. So with a long lifespan and lots of broods, birds should be pretty productive. To have a moderate decline with those facts is a worry, and that's why it's a conservation priority species. This is a typical male house sparrow, seen from below, which isn't most useful, but what it does show up quite well is the black bib. They all have a black bib under their bill, and it should go on the top of the breast, and that's a typical male inbreeding plumage. And you'll see from most of my other pictures that very few of those are in that. They often have the black bib, but the black breast isn't, or the bib extension onto the breast isn't there. In fact, this one. So this one hasn't got that. It's probably got a black bib. You can't see it; it's turned the other way. But the black bib on the chest, breast is there, but it's hidden under other feathers and will sort of emerge as the breeding season approaches. The main difference between a lot of this and a lot of other sparrows, which you'll see in other pictures, you just about see it here, is the top of the head is grey. The sides are chocolate brown, but the top of the head is grey. And this is the female, and really very different. And I can understand people who get confused by female sparrows because they often look like something else and they get forgotten. People assume the other one might be a tree sparrow and this is a house sparrow, or this is a dunnock or something like that. You have to look at that bill, typical sparrow's bill. The wings are the same pattern as a house sparrow. So there's a problem, but I can understand it's a real contrast from the male. This one, a little bit of a sort of scrutiny of this. I got the photograph worth showing. It looks a female. It is a female. Well, though we don't know for certain. It's a juvenile. And it's a juvenile just out of the nest, so it hasn't got its full adult plumage. And what you can see is on the side of the bill, the yellow gape, what's left over from wide yellow stimulating gape that they would normally have to food off their parents. This is the one that's declining even faster and disappeared from huge chunks of Britain now, and this is tree sparrow. And it's this chocolate brown head. You see no grey on the top of the head of a tree sparrow, and the face pattern quite different. It's got this sort of cheek patch, black, smudgy, black grey cheek patch, and which gives the effect of it being a white collar. Mustn't be confused with reed bunting, which also has a white collar. The only other bird really has a white collar, but I often see the white collar before I see the cheek smudge. There's another picture, just a slightly different position, and I couldn't decide between which two pictures to put in, so I put them both in. But you see the wing pattern, the wing in the back is very much like house sparrow. You see them from behind, and you might be confused. As you go south in Europe, you find other sparrows. And if you go down into Italy, you get something which I think is still, I didn't mean to check this, but I think it's a race of house sparrow. And it's sort of halfway between another species and house sparrow. And it tends to be called Italian sparrow. And yes, you do find it in Italy. And it's got the head markings more of a tree sparrow. It's got the chocolate head all over, but not the cheek patch. So, and it's got a very fine black bib but typical sparrow-like back. But that's the sort of Italian race. This one is a full different species and has been for years. This is the one you find in Spain, Canary Islands, North Africa. This is the Spanish sparrow, and it looks like a very dark, very heavy version of the house sparrow. And it's not all over Spain. It's a bit patchy. Certainly had Spanish holidays and never seen them. So, but then you come across them by chance. But the Canary Islands are quite good for them. I think this was Tenerife or somewhere. This one, this is very unusual, really. I don't know why we threw it in, but it's another sparrow in the same group, and it's the Iago sparrow, and it's only found on the Cape Verde Islands, so off the coast of Africa, a bit further south. But you can see how it must have evolved from the sparrows we've been looking at, and it is the only sparrow they've got there. So I don't think house sparrow's got there yet, but anyway, it's the only place it occurs. Habits, well, it's related to the weavers of Africa, and I'll have something to say about that in a moment. So the weaver birds of Africa, which build the wonderful nests, house sparrow is a sort of branch of that same family, and which probably moved north following people as the sort of humanoids as they move north out of Africa. So the house sparrows probably went with them. It's communal all year round. It's always in colonies. It associates with human, which I've just more or less said. And it breeds in not just only communal all through the year, it breeds in colonies. So if you get one house sparrow, you usually get quite a lot close together. And that's very important, because if you want to encourage them to your garden, you shouldn't just have one nest box. You have to put up 2 or 3. And again, I'll show you an example of that in a moment. it's flocks outside the breeding season. So you get flocks in sort of around stubble yards, if those things still exist, out on stubble fields, which don't exist either really, but that's where they used to go and feed in quite sizable flocks. They were itinerant, but they didn't actually go very far, but they were in flocks when they went. And when they come back at night, they roost communally as well. And having got a sparrow roost, actually, it's in our neighbour's bush, not mine, and he doesn't like it. I mean, he hasn't done anything about it, but it's so noisy. I mean, it only lasts for about 20 minutes. But when you get 20 or 30 house sparrows in one small bush, they are incredibly noisy. And they prefer to feed no further than about five meters from cover. So they need somewhere where they can retreat back into quite quickly. You don't see them, if you see them in parks, you see them around the edges and around the shrubberies, and not right out in the middle on the grass. And plumage, looking after their plumage, they're very clean birds, and they do seem to do more than many other birds, because they do a lot of this, splashing around in puddles. So house sparrows seem to like a good bathe, and this one is really throwing the water around. But they also, more unusually, like a grass bath. And I'm sure you've seen this in gardens or perhaps parks where you may have come across it. Sometimes corners of car parks, if there are any house sparrows there. And they've a little sort of hollow in the ground, and they move around in it, rifle the soil through their feathers. The grains. Somebody once explained it to me. It was a bit like having I don't know, sort of a dry shower. But it would definitely helps the feather care, because if they're not disturbed, you can see that they have a jolly good preen after doing this, and it's all helping to dislodge the lice and mites which might be living in those feathers, ensuring that their feathers stay in the best possible condition for the whole year until they renew them. The voice, I haven't got a recording, but I'm sure you know it. The chipping call, chip, 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 chip. It gets faster and more ecstatic during courtship, to the point that the same sound speeded up is more or less their song. They don't do anything different for a sparrow song. It's just a fast version of their call. It's quite fun to hear it. Something else there. The habitat. There was something else there to say. Yeah. Perhaps it'll come back. But if there's display going on, then other sparrows get very noisy, and will follow the displaying birds. So anyway, we'll probably come back to that under breeding. Habitat, towns and cities. Hopefully, although having done some work on house sparrows in Bankside, around the back of the Tate Modern, and around Borough Market, there was amazingly few house sparrows. We only found them in one place where there was an overgrown wall. I think sparrows definitely like untidiness. I think we are too tidy. Towns and cities, suburbia. In suburbia, what's very noticeable as I talk to different groups and people is that you'll get one person say, "Oh, loads of house sparrows, don't see the problem," and somebody else say, "Haven't seen them for 10 years." In other words, they're not even in a relatively small area. Different people are seeing them or not seeing them, and the birds they're not flying from one end of the small town to another. In our village, I know there are 3 sites where I can expect to find house sparrows, and after that, they're quite hard to find. Farms, traditionally, they, of course, because the grain is there, and they are seldom far from human habitation. Though human habitation, actually, we should include barns, pigsties, cowsheds, perhaps not human habitation, but buildings, perhaps would be better to say. Range and distribution, highly sedentary. I think that's coming through. They never go very far. Juvenile dispersal, the young may go up to 4 kilometers from where they hatched out, which for birds is really not very far at all. Exceptionally, they may go up to 26 kilometers. That's 20 miles or so. That's an exception. But post-breeding flocks, after the breeding season, flocks of adults and juveniles will move out into a good feeding area. Traditionally, this used to be fields where there was grain and stuff. But I think part of the problem is that combine harvesters and harvesting machinery are just so efficient now. I shouldn't say that, but but of course they are. They want them to be, but that means there isn't nearly so much spilt, there's not so much wasted, and therefore there isn't sort of free food around. Add that to over tidiness that we tend to have, and there's nowhere for them to go at night. Then you have a problem for house sparrows. This is the traditional a distribution of house sparrow. It's an old world species going right into Asia, down into the Middle East, down into India, and parts of North Africa. Very wide range. But then you might think, oh, hang on, I've seen them elsewhere. Surely they're in America, aren't they? And I did research this a bit, and the cultural links, which I sort of finished this part with, is they've been introduced to New York in 1852, Australia, Victoria in 1863, Buenos Aires in 1872, Durban in 1893, Santiago, Chile in 1904, Rio de Janeiro in 1905, and Easter Island, good heavens, introduced from Chile in 1928. So people have taken these bird settlers, or perhaps people from Europe, the old world, have taken these to new sites where they have been ready colonists. The diet is varied, mainly grain, cereal feeding from herbs. As I said, it might travel out into the fields after harvest time. But the young, and this is worth knowing and remembering, they're not seed eaters primarily. They feed on invertebrates, especially caterpillars, small caterpillars. And that may be a clue to the decline. It may come back to insect food, although it's a granular feeding bird, a grain-eating species. It may be the insects that are doing it for the young. And of course, it takes scraps from humans, and it visits bird feeders, and I'm sure you knew that. Roosts, they tend to be communal, said that already, often in very thick shrubs and bushes. Gardeners, I think, are over tidy. I've said that already, but I'd just like to elaborate on that, because so often in autumn, people cut down the bushes and shrubs, saying, well, the breeding season's over, they won't need that for nesting until next spring, totally forgetting that you need somewhere for birds to go and roost at night. Winter nights are absolutely critical for not just sparrows, but small birds, and leaving them places to roost is so important. Many roost in old buildings or roost in buildings. They have been seen roosting in street lights, but if they can get in, which is nice and warm. And there's some of the cavities which they've used for roosts, and they've found they've actually lined them a bit like a nest. Breeds in colonies, let's rush on because we're coming up to our interval time. Breeds in colonies up to 10 or 20 pairs, close, not next side by side, but not far away from each other. They're known as socially monogamous, which means they are pairs, but there's a bit of infidelity goes on. And some males are bigamous, and this has been studied. People do that. And DNA has shown that infidelity is quite common and around 15%. They've looked at the DNA of the young of a normal pair, and then find that 15% are not that parentage. Pairs are faithful to a nest site. They may not be faithful to their mate, but they are faithful to a nest site. And either sex is replaced in these communities. If there's mortality, then another bird will replace the one that's gone. And they've got one study which showed one female acquired 7 different partners in very quick succession. Not a very good picture, but it's the only one I've got of a house sparrow displaying. And that's it's quite a dramatic pose, isn't it? Just a bit on breeding, variety of nest sites, nesting in cavities. Females will often choose their weight for a male to be calling, and that will be an indication that the male is looking for a female. Males start some buildings, and male and female paired together, so they can't see all that. But male and female will start the building together, which is quite unusual. Sometimes it's the males that do, or rather the females that do all the nest building. And ownership is indicated by this incessant chirruping, which goes on and on and on during the breeding season, which, as I say, is sort of their equivalent of a song. There's the nest boxes on my garage, three, identical. In the year I put those boxes up, all three were used, and another nest tucked in behind one of them. This is a typical nest. You never have thought that was made by a weaver. They seem to have lost the power of the weavers to build dramatic nests, but they don't need it anymore because they nest in hollows and in holes and things. So they don't have to build a self-supporting nest. So they've lost the ability to build that. This came from a fuselage of a military helicopter as a point of interest. Conservation, there is decline. Doesn't need any commentary. It's not good, not good. Overall population in rural areas declined by 47% by 2000. Those in urban and suburban areas have declined by about 60%. Change in density indicates that the decline was strongest in London and Eastern Britain. So in spite of you thinking lots of food and lots of opportunities in London, London is not as good as it was for sparrows in the past. And while interested, and this has happened in other parts of Western Europe, it's not just us. So there is something going on. Although there have been increases in Scotland and Wales, not all bad news, but because there've been huge declines elsewhere, those aren't over significant. But I did want to, and I'm sorry I have overrun on this a bit, but the cultural links are quite fun, so I just share this with you. Passid domesticus means house sparrow. That's Latin for house, sparrow house. Local name sprug, spruggy sparrow. Middle English sparrow. The roosts are called chapels. Now, these names were dreamt up, I think, by posh Victorians, and I think chapels is a very derogatory term in their terms. Sparrow weddings are a euphemism for frantic sexual activity, which usually involves the rape of a female. Sorry about that, but that seems to be what goes on. In history, it's a bird that's been linked to lechery and sex during the very first, and that's, we think, is due to their very public mating habits. People have seen these active sparrow weddings in the past and applied them to human activities. Whoops, come back in. Roman courtesans kept male house sparrows as playthings. Better not elaborate on that because I don't know how that worked. Chaucer's brothel owner is said to be as lecherous as a sparrow. So even Chaucer had these down as yeah, not the best. And of course, it was a pest in the past when most of our buildings were thatched. So it seemed like an obvious one to put in. So many people are seeing these, especially with Big Garden Birdwatch being last weekend. I imagine people would have, well, some people would have seen them in their garden. I had them in my garden for probably the first time for quite a few weeks. Or it may be they're coming and I just don't see them. Like spending a whole hour, you see things that you wouldn't perhaps have otherwise noticed. There we are. Let's start with a graph, get that out of the way. That really demonstrates where they've come from and where they're going to. That is a pretty dramatic increase. And it's not entirely clear why. In there somewhere is people feeding good quality bird food, no doubt. More hanging food in gardens. Goldfinches learning to go onto feeders and finding that they probably had a decline of greenfinches and other sort of bossy birds, so they haven't had as much problems. So that maybe account for it. Or they may be breeding better, or perhaps climate change is helping them. So not everything will fade because of climate change. It's not all bad news. Here's our chart, of course, and it's green, not surprisingly. And in fact, it's described as a strong increase. I think it's the only bird I've got that down for some time. And again, one of the clues there is they can have 4 to 6 eggs at a time and 2 to 3 broods in a year. So if they have got the food, then they have the ability to breed quite prolifically. And not as old as sparrows, funnily enough, but perhaps they are a more delicate bird and perhaps prone to moving around more, and perhaps there are more risks involved in that. Oldest so far, 14 years. Description, well, I won't go through it blow by blow. You know about the colours of a goldfinch, but it's worth pointing out that there are very slight differences in the face pattern, but otherwise, to all intents and purposes, male and female are similar. Difficult to work out the differences. When you see them together, you can just about work it out sometimes. For a finch, the bill, the pale bill, stands out very well, but it's also really quite long and very pointed. And we'll see a reason for that in a moment. The juvenile, which I will show you, lacks a distinctive face pattern. And I've got a picture here of one that's a juvenile that's acquiring its adult plumage. And I've got one that shows none whatsoever somewhere else. But they're a bit difficult to identify. But the wing pattern is always there. The voice, yeah, I mean, we're probably used to it. You probably hear goldfinches and know that call. It's a pretty tinkling song. Most people use the word tinkling or chiming. But if you see them singing, or if you hear them singing, have a look at them because they're really cute. They pivot like a toy clockwork a clockwork toy on a branch, and they swing from side to side quite regularly, but quite quickly. It's a really fun thing to watch. In fact, I think there are sort of older autonomous toys which have on the continent that have mimicked goldfinch song, sort of thing you can make onto a musical box and get the bird on the top to make the same sorts of sort of actions. um, they also have a song flight, which isn't quite so obvious, but it's slow and hesitant compared to its normal flight. So if they're breeding around, do look out for that. And the flight call when they are around is very similar to their songs. All these songs and calls are sound all like goldfinch. Once you know one of them, they sort of go across the whole lot. What I didn't know, funny, putting this thing together, I hadn't sort of picked up before that both male and female sing. Now, of course, it's normally very difficult to know whether female birds sing, especially when they look like the males. But because they've been kept in captivity historically, and particularly on the continent, it is well known, and they're often kept because they sound nice to some people anyway. Then we do know that it's just as likely to be the female singing as the male. So the male is still probably the better songster, but the female quite capable of singing as well. It's often in flocks with siskins and redpolls on alder, like the picture here on alder cones. The largest flocks, of course, are in autumn and winter when they've outside their breeding territories, and they're quite itinerant. They're moving around the countryside, and the flocks continue. They still continue to flock even within the breeding season, and the sort of birds that are off duty, who are not needed for egg incubation or feeding young at that particular time, will often join together. So there will be still flocks moving around. I came across one description which was quite intriguing actually, and the flocks were described in winter as being highly organized mobile units with communication signals for finding patchy and shifting food sources. Because of course, being in a flock, you don't mind if your friends come with you, as long as there's plenty of that food, but it is going to run out at some point, and then there are lots of eyes going and looking for the next lot. And so the communication is important, and the gregarious nature of the feeding is also part of their lifestyle. And they have stylized and ritualized courtship displays, which part of that involves this autonomous swinging backwards and forwards on their perch when they're singing, but also includes courtship feeding, where the male will feed the female. Not uncommon in birds, but not a huge number of species do it. Robin and blue tit are the other ones that come to mind, greenfinch, I think. But otherwise, it's relatively unusual. Migration, hugely complex. I don't really get my head quite around what's going on. I'm not sure anybody does. Some of our goldfinches leave, some stay, and some others arrive from elsewhere. So we've got a total muddled population, and I think this accounts for why you may get goldfinches in your garden one winter and not have them next, or we have them half a winter and then not the rest of the winter. They do come and go a bit. But here's one of these BTO maps again. And again, don't bother about the colours, but you can see that we have got some sort of movement between our birds and the continent. This time it's southern Europe. Last time it was Scandinavia. Oops, go back. Scandinavia, but it's sort of the Low Countries and then through France and down through Spain even. So there's fair movement of goldfinches going on. The habitats rather, well, lowlands, orchards, cemeteries, parks, gardens, often near water, no, often near towns, streams, and near woodland edges. Um, that's almost anywhere apart from the middle of dense woods and mountaintops and sea cliffs. But no, and that's putting it strongly. But nevertheless, they are quite widespread in the countryside if the food is there. The diet is seeds, and you can see here on this teasel head, I've gone in really close to try and see how it's using that bill. And you can see the advantage of its longer than average finch's bill can get inside the prickly teasel to get out seeds, and there you see them regularly on teasel growths. Speciality thistles and teasels are their favourites. But they will take some insects, and again, in the breeding season, insects are an important part of the diet. Breeding, they often nest close to each other. They are loosely colonial. The nest is built by the female. Female then incubates and broods the eggs and then the young, but the male feeds the female at the nest. That's an extension of the courtship feeding thing, I guess, and also brings in food to the young. So it's a good cooperation over bringing up the family. Cultural links with goldfinches. Well, early names is King Harry, Redcap, Harry Redcap. Is this Henry VIII they're referring to? Did Henry VIII wear a red cap? I don't know where the origin of this is, but anyway, I love these old names. The collective name is Charm of Goldfinches, of course, from Old English charm, which is supposedly describes the tinkling sound of their song. It all comes back to this bell-like tinkering, and it is very noticeable. Traditionally, it was a popular cage bird. Was it 160,000 captured in one year near Worthing in Sussex, and in 1860, that was in 1860, and in 1890s. 12 dozen, that's a very neat figure, so 144, were caught in a morning in London. Yes, this cage bird trade was huge. And even when I first went to the RSPB in the late 60s, early 70s, we would hear about raids on places where they were catching and then selling on finches of all sorts. But goldfinch was always going to be a popular one, of course, because it looks so nice. And of course, there's association with Christianity, and it appears in many religious paintings. And so I went and sort of dug out a couple, I don't own them, dug out some pictures just to see what this really meant. And it's quite interesting. So here's the Madonna of the Goldfinch by Raphael. There we are. Two children, Jesus and John, and there, and I'll get it up bigger. It's a goldfinch. They're looking after it quite well. They're holding its legs a bit tight and stroking it, but it's no doubt it's a goldfinch. The other one is the Madonna of the Goldfinch, 1770 by Trapiola. Intriguing picture. Again, there's the baby holding a goldfinch, again, very accurately painted. But if I go in closer, you can see intriguingly, well, perhaps the artist will have seen tame goldfinches and know that if you take a baby takes it, it will fly away. So it is attached. He's got a piece of string around its leg, or twine, and I guess that's probably what happened a lot for these pet birds. So there's our goldfinch. There's a final portrait. And we'll finish off with woodpeckers, which when I was talking to Alison originally, was going to be the two common ones in London, but I've had to slip in the third woodpecker. Simply, it would be wrong to just ignore it because there are some problems there. So we're talking about lesser spotted woodpecker, green woodpecker, and great spotted woodpecker. and we'll do them all in one go. So there's quite a few comparisons. The first comparison is grey spotted is green and a strong increase. Green woodpecker is green with a moderate increase, and lesser spotted is red with a strong decline. And look at that figure. Have I put it an arrow to it? Yes. At the time this was written, and it's 3 or 4 years out of date, 800 thought to, that would be pairs, be surviving in Britain. I mean, that's a tiny number. I don't know where to go to even hopefully see a lesser spotted woodpecker these days. This is really sad. Identification, great spotted, black and white, pied appearance with white patches, scarlet under the tail, scarlet nape of the male. Then green woodpecker, of course, is lime green with a red cap, yellow-green rump, which is very obvious in flight, and a black moustache. But it actually, in the middle of it, it's dull red in the male and all black on the female. So it is possible to separate the sexes, but I find it very hard to see. But then the lesser spotted is so tiny. I mean, people say, oh, could it be greater or could it be lesser? The greater is the size of a blackbird, the lesser is the size of a house sparrow. So really, there isn't much confusion once you see them anything like properly. Again, it's black and white, but it's barred rather than patchy black and white. But all the woodpeckers have this bouncing flight with the wings appearing to close between flaps. It's very distinctive. The only other bird that looks anything like it, I think, although you don't really see them at the same time, is little owl. Here's a typical great spotted woodpecker. And this was at the lodge, I seem to remember. There's a this was at Falmere. This is a male, and it was like in that position for probably 10 minutes. I think it was aggressive posture, but it looked quite fierce, and its bill is held at a very funny angle. But I couldn't see why it was posturing in this way. But it was obviously a piece of behaviour. And I've only ever seen it once, and it was doing it for long enough for me to get actually a sort of half good picture of it. Green woodpecker, familiar with those, much more likely to be seen on the ground than any other woodpeckers, very comfortable on the ground because their food is on the ground. This is actually on my garden lawn on a year that I had a lot of daisies. And there's I've had to borrow the lesser spotted woodpecker. Tiny picture, tiny bird. Voice, great spotted woodpecker has a sharp tack, 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 tack. Green, of course, is that loud echoing laugh. Lesser spotted has a sort of trill, beep, 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 which I don't hear. All of them, all drum, but great spot is the most commonly heard drumming. Diet, all woodpeckers have very long tongues. They're mostly for taking out insects in holes in dead wood, behind bark, somewhere that it's very difficult to otherwise get their bill into. I'll show you how it works in a minute. Green woodpeckers like ants, and therefore that's why they feed on the ground, so they can hack open an anthill, and they can use their long tongue for sort of going down through the chambers to get out the tasty queen ants and things like that. Grey spotted and sometimes green will drink sap. And actually, I've sort of known that, never really seen it. And then one year we had red hot pokers in our garden, and young woodpeckers, great spotted woodpeckers, were coming and clinging to them and obviously taking the sap. So using their tongue, of course, they can use their tongue to get into the tubes of the plants. And great spotted will take some fruits and seeds as well. And great spotted will also use an anvil. And what it will do is to put a seed or a pine cone or something like that into a crevice and then hack it, because its bill is so strong, you can hack it open. Here's how the configuration of the tongue works. It goes through the mouth and then up round the back of the skull and over the top of the cranium or underneath the cranium. A very strange thing. But I did dig around for pictures showing the tongue in use, and look at this. I hardly believe this picture when I saw it. It looks like it's got an earthworm, but that's the green woodpecker's tongue getting juices from apples. And then another one looks most weird, doesn't it? The magic of digital photography. Migrations, well, really nothing to speak of. Resident over most of its range, hardly any of them move anywhere. Um, and so much so, great spotted woodpecker has only, I think probably in the last 15 years, something like that, actually reached Ireland for the first time. There may have just been a tiny number there before that, but they're very, very recent colonists. So, and they're doing well in Britain. So that shows an island so close has been slow to get colonized. There have been eruptions on the continent when there's been food shortages. Birds will do this. Even the most sedentary birds, of course, if the food is short, will have to move, and woodpeckers are no exception. Um, Breeding, of course, they excavate their own nest chamber. You know that, of course. Um, there's no connection with the drumming. The drumming is a pure communication. That's the equivalent of their song, and the chamber is excavated by the male and female working together, um, and it's usually only used in 1 year. So all that work and it gets used once. The chamber may be used for roosting after the breeding season. That's the only other time it might get used. And this is a photograph I took when we did the filming for Bird in the Nest many years ago, where the BBC camera team had taken the back off a cherry tree, a dead cherry tree, in which it was a woodpecker's nest. And they'd inserted a plate glass window and then put a hide round it, and they could put camera in, which didn't disturb the birds at all. And I'm not sure whether, because of the configuration of the zoom screen, whether you can see the hole at the top. But I like being able to see the hole in this picture because it gives you some sort of dimensions of how much effort and how big that hole is, because these birds are about the size of a blackbird, to be dug out each year by the adults. So quite a remarkable structure. Conservation of great spotted woodpecker. The rapid increase and now stable, as I've said that. No change in the production of young. They don't seem to be producing any more or any less young, which is quite good. They are laying earlier by about 2 weeks, so they do get the advantage. There's always a worry when that happens because it's not sure that their main food supply might be available 2 weeks earlier when it comes to bringing up the young. This is this disconnect between food, adults and food, and juveniles and food. May be a problem with climate change, but we can't quite see yet. There is good evidence that nest survival, birds are doing better in their nest than they used to. And this is possibly because there's less competition from starlings. Starlings would have liked those holes in the past and may have outed a few of the birds. And of course, use of garden feeders. I certainly have great spot using my garden to come and eat peanuts, particularly, and so they've got an extra supply of food when they need it, perhaps when their natural food is short. But here's the laying dates of great spotted woodpecker, and you can see, without going into exactly the number of days, yes, it's about 10, 12 days earlier, over a period of 1970 to 1920, so 2020, so over a 40, 50-year period. And then look at the population. Again, don't worry too much with the figures, but that says it all for great spotted woodpecker. Green woodpecker, not enough information on the demographic trends, difficult birds to survey for some reason. Ecological factors on increase in population size are not known, so they are going up, but we don't really understand why. It could be that it's susceptible to cold weather, and we've had some pretty mild winters recently, especially if it's feeding on the ground on things like ant hills. That they, in really hard winters, that food supply is going to become much more difficult. And they don't seem to be limited by nest sites in southern Britain, at least anyway. So it's not quite clear what's going on with green woodpecker. The one theory is that the upward trend may be due to the availability of food outside of the woods. In fact, because they're feeding on the ground, they can go further away from the woods. The woods may have less food than they had before. There was one. I think I put it in here. I'll get to it in a minute. Also, higher survival rate due to mild winters. That could well be a factor. And perhaps I didn't put it in. I did come across somebody who drew an analogy between the decrease of lesser spotted woodpecker and the decrease in moths in woodlands. But nobody seems to know quite how important that is in the diet of the great lesser-spotted woodpecker. But it could just be there are certainly shortage of flying insects. Sorry, this is where I probably put it. The conservation of lesser-spotted woodpecker, reasons for decline are unknown. It's also declining in mainland Europe. We're not unique. Um, the number of young have declined, so that points to perhaps a food source. If they produce the young and then they don't survive, that's a problem. Lots of young probably die due to starvation. Loss of open woodlands suggests is a possible cause. Competition from great spotted woodpecker. Great spotted woodpecker is getting more common. Lesser is getting rarer. Is there a conflict between the two? It has been suggested. Grey squirrels may well be another cause. Perhaps lessers are not man enough to stand up to a grey squirrel, where great spotted can or green would. And I don't know, as I said, this is where I put it in. The moth population is declining, and it does seem to be a very similar shaped graph to the decline of lesser spotted woodpecker. A few cultural links. Green woodpecker, old name of yaffle, because they sound as if they're laughing. Really good name, I think. Shame we don't use it, actually. Yaffle's such a nice name. Professor Yaffle in Bagpuss. There we are. There's modern culture for you, or relatively modern. Woody woodpecker, which of course was not a British woodpecker, American. Rainbird, lots of associations with green woodpecker and rain. That yaffling call it's thought to link in with changing weather. Never seen anybody who can made that link, but that's a theory. But it's certainly well known as a rainbird in much of Shetland, particularly. It's only known as the rainbird, or mostly. And there was also a cult of the woodpecker going back into Neolithic times, all very mysterious, linked to Roman gods and all that's post Neolithic. Anyway, there is a cult of the woodpecker, which is mysterious. Look it up, because there have been books written about it. And there's woodpecker cider. And the other thing with woodpeckers, they're mentioned by Chaucer, so he knew about them. And here's woody woodpecker. And here is William Morris, who also knew about green woodpeckers. And in one of these tapestries, you look closely, he links it to the King Picus myth. I won't bother with that. Sorry, I didn't mean to put that in. But if you look closely at the tapestry, you can see there is a crude but quite accurately representation of a green woodpecker in an apple tree. I suppose it's an apple tree. Anyway, so William Morris knew about his green woodpeckers. Other cultural links, coming to the end now, but I did like this. Aristotle, who gets a bad press. I mean, he collected so much about nature, got quite a lot wrong, and an awful lot right. And I thought his descriptions of woodpeckers was really very accurate. He calls them grub eaters. Pied and barred, so obviously great spotted and lesser, have similar voices, except the greater is louder. Fair enough. Both forage by fastening onto tree trunks. Yeah, that's a good description. Fastening. I never thought of it like that, but that's good. There is also the green woodpecker, green all over, with a loud voice. Well, that would, I reckon that's better than a lot of the Victorian bird books managed to do. And then finally, and I have come to the end, a photograph hit the press about 5 years ago, and nobody knew whether it was real or not. We still don't, but I think it is. It was anyway. It's this one. It's not very good. This is a poor picture of a poor picture. But this green woodpecker in flight with a stoat riding piggyback on the back of it. We assume the stoat was attacking the green woodpecker, and in the process, the green woodpecker flew off, and the stoat wouldn't let go, and both bird and mammal, soared into the air together. Quite an amazing picture. What a chance photograph to actually get that.